Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, I'm Welsh, not English. This is important. Now you know that. To confuse the two, we're a vengeful culture, right? That's the seventh generation. One of the things about Welsh is we speak it much faster than the English. So if I start to do that, the first noun of every Welsh word changes, the first letter of every noun changes according to the word that comes before it. So if I want to say Wales, it's Cymru. If I want to say the Welsh, it becomes a Gymru. The C changes to a G. No? On there? Yeah. Okay. The C changes to a G. It's actually designed so we can sing a sentence as a single word. Right? And if I start to do that with English, feel free to slow me down, right? As we go on that. The second thing is I'm really happy to be interrupted, challenged, or asked questions. That really is not a problem. Right? And to some extent, what I'm going to teach and what I'm going to talk about depends a bit on your responses. Yeah? So we're going to try and do this and give you a chance to come back as we go through it. Right? So that's the basic plan. Yeah? The name for what we do is called naturalizing sense-making. The origins of this go back to when I worked for IBM. So I had after about 3 or 4 years of work around the world after leaving university, working in indigenous Australia, in Latin America and elsewhere, which was formative. I ended up in a series of business management roles from HR to finance, then into consultancy, then into software, then into building decision support systems, and then into strategy. So that was kind of like a career progression. And then IBM bought the company. It took them 48 hours from first contact to purchase. It was very scary. And I got picked out and put in one of those wonderful roles IBM did in the days of Lou Gerstner, which is, we'll pay you a decent salary, do whatever you want, provided you upset people. Because they were trying a transformation. And my target in my second year, because my boss used to do targets retrospectively, sit you down at the end of the year, work out what you've done, is it good or bad, then we'll write your targets as if we were writing them at the start of the year, which is very practical. I'll explain some of the reasons why that works. HR got angry with him over that, so he decided to teach them a lesson. So the next year, my target was I got X $1,000 for every director of IBM who demanded in writing I was fired, and Y $1,000 for every vice president of IBM who demanded in writing in fired. And if I got a general manager, I got it all in one. HR went ballistic with him because they said that was, and he said, no, it's strategy. Our strategy in acquiring this company was to create a service business when we're manufacturing. The strategy says this is going to upset people who need to be upset, and we need to protect the people who are doing it. So I said, it's strategy, it's measurable, I've got the authority, I'm doing it. They never, ever challenged him again, right? I overachieved on that target, but that's another story, right? Particularly with Ginny Rometty, and that was when I left. Either way, I survived 7 years in IBM before I failed the test of obedience, which has kind of been the story of my life. And then the Singapore government came along, and we've been working with DARPA, the American defense sector, on weak signal detection, and conflict resolution. So in the build-up to 9/11, we were working on how do you get people from radically different political backgrounds to have a rational, objective discussion about a current policy situation where their careers are at stake. I can talk about that later if you want. That was a really successful project. We concluded it in the Pentagon the day before 9/11, in the bit which got hit by the plane. I flew out that night, picked up the news the next day, and then things got more serious. And the project migrated very quickly to what's called weak signal detection. So how do you identify now something with the benefit of hindsight you will realize was actually important? Because actually it's easy when you look backwards to see what you should make sense of, but it's very difficult at the time because of the sheer volume of data, and that's what we worked on. And then the Singapore government, who were monitoring DARPA, came along and made an offer. So with Peter Schwartz, I co-designed, didn't co-create, I co-designed, right? The risk assessment horizon scanning system, and that moved that project on. Then got picked up in government, in the not-for-profit sector extensively, and in industry. So that's kind of like the background. So it's come out of a mixture of charity work, business experience, strategy experience, then moving into an R&D role. And the kind of like approach we've always adopted is not to use cases. This is a bit controversial, so I'll explain it. So my background is physics and philosophy, right? It was an indulgence when I did it, but it's proved quite useful since. But anybody with a theoretical physics background will tell you that you can't trust a social scientist because they never have enough data to form any valid conclusion. We used to say they suffer from physics envy, which was a deliberate play on words. And over the years, I haven't seen any reason whatsoever to challenge that. All right? And you see this extensively in management science. And management science has gone through two major revolutions. It's currently in the third in my lifespan. One was scientific management, where the business models were actually military, which are actually quite adaptive. Military framing of leadership is very adaptive because it changes in context. What we then saw in the 80s and 90s when systems thinking came along was a switch to an engineering metaphor, which is actually intolerant of ambiguity and wants certainty. And that's the problem we've got at the moment. We're now switching with complexity science, and by the way, it's systems thinking and complexity science, and that tells you the difference, right? Which is an ecological metaphor. Now, I'm going to emphasize this. What it says is you have to understand where you are and what is possible before you decide what you should do. Now, it may feel like it's just common sense, but the reality of the last 30 or 40 years has been executives with expensive consultants getting together and agreeing how things should be, then desperately trying to close the gap. Which, by the way, means they're doomed to fail, which creates a continuous 3-year cycle for management consultants, which is what the model is about. Sorry, I'm really cynical, and you're going to see that come through. Yeah, I've lived through this. Yeah? So kind of like the problem is that each of what they're all doing in terms of if you look at the popular books, I'll give you an example from good to great, for example, is they go and identify a group of companies who they think have a quality which is desirable. Generally success. Yeah? And then they actually go in and they interview people, and mistake number one, they believe what executives say about their companies. This is a fundamental error. Every time we've sent in ethnographers to check reality, it doesn't match in any way what senior middle management and executives think is going on. So I'm going to come later to a method by which you continuously, in real time, sense what your employees or citizens are thinking. Because you can't afford for that to be mediated through multiple levels of management. So that's something I'll come back to later. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, they can't interview enough people. And problem number three is confusion of correlation with causation. So if Hong Kong wants to increase the number of Nobel Prizes it wins, it's very simple. You don't need an educational system. All you need to do is increase dark chocolate consumption. Dark chocolate consumption per head of population directly correlates with Nobel Prizes for head of population for the last 5 decades on a bigger data set than you will see in any social science research or management science research. So go and eat chocolate. Yeah? The one which I think is actually causal is peaks in attempts to commit suicide by drowning worldwide directly correlate with the release of Nicolas Cage movies, but I can see a reason for that. If you want to go and have a look at the site on false correlations and then look at any management textbook and say what's going on. So if I take Good to Great, which is a really well-disciplined book, he goes and identifies a group of companies who've been successful for a long period of time. Yeah, IBM was one of them. He then goes and interviews them and actually identifies things that they did. He finds things they did in common. He's a Harvard professor, so then he writes a book with nice phrases like the hedgehog principle. I mean, they're trained to do that. And then you've got the recipe. If you do these things, you too will have long-term success. Now, rather embarrassingly, all those companies have failed quite spectacularly since the book came out. One of the reasons is if you look at the companies he selected, right? First of all, he only selected for positive. He didn't select for negative. That's really bad research. Secondly, there is a much better explanation. He picked the apex predator in a market. The first company into a field, like IBM created computing, will survive no matter how incompetent they are until the field changes. Now that's me starting to do what we do. I'm using natural science to look at a problem and saying we know about apex predators, we know about keystone species, we know about the way that that works. So now we can apply that into the system. Another example is Lean Startup. If anybody's read Lean Startup? Oh, you've escaped that. It's a very popular book in the computing community. So this guy goes and studies successful startup companies in the Valley. And he interviews the chief executives of those startup companies. So again, that's the problem. People who've been successful remember things very differently from people who haven't been successful. You can't trust any retrospective study of what actually happened because success or failure changes the way people see the world. Yeah? He doesn't study companies who failed. And he identifies a series of things that those companies did and says, do these things, you will be successful. Yeah? Now, we did similar research with Dorothy Leonard at Harvard when I was in IBM, and we studied the companies who'd failed. They all did exactly the same things as the companies who succeeded. It's just there were so many of them, some were bound to succeed anyway. Start to get the point I'm trying to make? Yeah? Now, don't get me wrong, we use a lot of social science. I'll talk about Deleuzian epistemology maybe later. Social science gives you explanation, but it doesn't give you prediction. And it doesn't give you certainty, whereas natural science is subject to peer review and people can repeat experiments. There's a major crisis in psychology at the moment, which is really embarrassing for coaches and HR people, because all the classic experiments, when people have retried them, they don't repeat. Right? If you can't repeat an experiment, you can't trust the results. No? So we took a different approach. We said, actually, we do know things about systems, we know things about human cognition, we know how people make decisions, and that's come from natural science, peer review, multiple experiments. So we can't apply that to the whole of a human system, but we can look at aspects of a system and say, we'll use that science as what's called an enabling constraint. Now, the best example I've got of that, that's what the naturalizing means in sense-making, is this. Classic experiment, repeated in different forms in many different ways. You give radiologists, I'm not sure why people pick radiologists, I think they did something terrible to a cognitive neuroscience once, so revenge has been sought at every available opportunity, all right? So you give radiologists a batch of x-rays, you ask them to look for anomalies. On the final x-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. 83% of radiologists will not see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. And the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who didn't. Nobody who isn't a radiologist has any chance whatsoever of seeing it. Right? This is called inattentional blindness. We do not see what we do not expect to see. Once you realize that, any process which assumes that executives will see things they don't expect to see is flawed. Training people to be more observant, talking about failures in the past, identifying weak signals isn't going to work because they won't see them unless they expect to see them. And the other problem at C-level, and I've been C-level, is the politics is such there are some things you're not allowed to see by virtue of your job. Yeah, we need to get realistic about this stuff. Right? Now, the reason for this, just to give you the science, this is Clark and other people's work, is the way human beings make decisions is we do multiple micro-hallucinations. Now, to be clear on this, AI has misused the term hallucination. AI bullshits, it doesn't hallucinate. What AI is trying to do is tell you what it thinks you're most likely to believe, yeah, based on its training data sets, and there are real issues with that. Right? So basically, human beings do multiple micro-hallucinations, and they come from previous experience, they come from people we talk and spend time with, those are stories. Stories are really important to human sense-making, I'll come back to that later. You can't escape the pattern of stories in your society. Now, I'll give you an example on that to make the point. So I said I'm Welsh. In the middle of the 19th century, the English passed an Act of Parliament which said Welsh was an uncivilizing influence on the Welsh and it had to be eliminated. Now, Welsh actually doesn't have any possessive pronouns, by the way, so you can't say I own anything. You can only say I'm with something. And that makes a big difference. It translates in all sorts of ways. So my grandmother, who spoke Welsh, and was the last in our family to speak it as a native, if she spoke Welsh in school, she had a wooden badge hung around her neck. and on it was written WN, Welsh not. Yeah? She then had to catch one of her friends speaking Welsh, at which point she could hand on the knot. And whoever wore the knot at the end of the day got thrashed by the teacher. Right? Everybody in Wales can tell you in that story. English people, you have to prove it happened because they're not familiar with it. Did the same in Indigenous Australia, by the way, in the same period. Eliminating people's language is a way of destroying their identity. Yeah? Now, that actually informs Welsh attitudes overall because it's a common story. And I'll talk later, we call them basically foundation stories or sacred stories. Finding out what those are in a population is really important. Yeah, because they reflect actually ways that we will see the world. And I'll talk about the science of that later. So we're hallucinating from our own experience, third-party experience, stories told by our grandparents, and also pure imagination. If you don't know it, art and music came before language in human evolution. Right? And we think the reason it developed from primitive cave paintings and drums to the heights of Wagner and Caravaggio, so I prepare my prejudices at the moment, is fundamentally what art does is it takes you away from reality so you see novel connections. Yeah? So art actually turns out to be absolutely critical to human sense-making, which is why a lot of us are worried about STEM education, because if you only focus on STEM education, you're losing something which is an essentially human characteristic. Leads to something I'll describe later, which is called abductive reasoning. Yeah, IT, computers use inductive. Yeah, humans actually evolved to be abductive. We see novel, unexpected patterns. Downside is it makes us prone to conspiracy theories. Yeah, so we're multiple hallucinations, multiple sources. This isn't a conscious process. And we're taking in multiple sensory data, so visual, oral, but also scent. How people smell determines whether you trust them or not. You can't do that in a virtual environment. We actually think pheromones actually do more than just trust. We think they're actually a way in which communication happens. Yeah, in terms of complex ideas. We know that resonance, if you put a mother with a baby in a bed and they sleep together without the husband, the mother's heart will go into resonance with the baby's heart and will restart it. We don't yet know the mechanism for that, but we know there's some sensory data. You start to see why we're worried about AI? You've got multiple sensory inputs from multiple sources, multiple micro-hallucinations, you blend those together, and you do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. So the first pattern which appears to fit, you apply. First coherent pattern. Now that makes evolutionary sense. If you think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to artistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified lion, look up best practice case studies on how to avoid lions? Yeah, by the time you've done that, the only manual of any use to you will be the Book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I've found of an escape manual from the digestive tract of a large carnivore written by a survivor. We evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on a partial data scan, privileging our most recent experiences. That's the way you all make decisions. Yeah? So anything which tries to train you to be more rational isn't going to work. It's not that it's a bad idea, but the reality is you will not see what you do not expect to see, and you will deny it even if you see it, if it won't fit in. Now, I'll come back to this later. One of the things we're now starting to work on, and I'm working with some of your schools at the moment on this as well when I'm out, is using, for example, citizens as a sensor network. So we've done this now in Sweden, we've done it in Wales, we've done it in Colombia, we've done it in Australia with Indigenous people. And we actually get 16-year-olds to go into their community every week from school to gather stories from that community about what's going on in it. This, by the way, is a big tick box for teachers, because it teaches them research, statistics, report writing, so actually the schools love it. We also do this with sports clubs and with church groups or religious groups. Yeah, we've got the young people. So we do that. I'll talk about how we do it later, but the point about that is what I'm building is a human sensor network. So in real time, I'm finding the day-to-day stories of people's ordinary existence And that's very different from what they say in focus groups or in response to questionnaires. Yeah, it's called the street stories. One of the reasons that the Democrats got it badly wrong in the States is they were marketing to Yale graduates, assuming people would make rational decisions, and they weren't listening to the street stories. Yeah, the street stories are determining how people see the work, and I'll give you some of the science of that later. So you see the principle of what we're doing. Well, we know people won't make rational decisions, but if I get every employee to interpret something and present the results graphically 5 minutes later, people will see patterns of attitude and they'll see outliers, so we can identify the 17%. Right, now that's kind of like where I'm going on this, is we start with the natural science, then we develop tools and methods. That process, by the way, takes about 5 or 6 years. Yeah, because you're reading a lot, that gives you other things to read, you move around. There's a point, and anybody who's done physics will know this, where it just looks right. And that comes quite quickly, yeah? And at that point, you hand it over to the experimental physicists, people whose maths wasn't good enough to be theoretical physicists, right? Sorry, old joke. They then play with it for 4 or 5 years, and then when it gets really boring, you give it to the engineers to execute at scale, right? That's kind of like the way it works in physics. We're doing the same approach. Yeah, anything I'm going to talk about has been 5 to 6 years in theoretical development, 4 to 5 years minimum in practical development, and now it's ready to scale. It's all also in an open source wiki, kinevin.io, so you can look at that background material. But I wanted to do that up front because that's the principle. Yeah? Don't use cases because they're biased. And also, is anything pre-COVID valid anymore? Is anything pre-Trump valid anymore? Yeah? The way people make decisions doesn't change. The way people have acted does change. And that can be significant. Right? So this is a way of reducing uncertainty and reducing risk in terms of the way things work. Now, that's the thing in this little book, which is called the EU Field Guide. It was written during COVID. Yeah, it's a practical guide on how you manage in complexity in a crisis. So I'm going to talk about bits and pieces of that as we go through, but you can download that for free, and you can get hard copy if you just pay the postage. If your country has had the sense to stay in the European Union, you wouldn't have to pay the postage, but that's a matter of national grief, right? That's been updated in this, which came out recently. I'll send you a link on this because the book chapter here this is a new handbook on future studies. The chapter I wrote in that, which is an update to the EU Field Guide, is open access. So anybody can download it. And as I say, the sponsorship on this came from Peter Ho, who was head of the civil service in Singapore. Yeah, very bright guy. I first met him. I still remember the way I met him. I was talking with the IBM general manager, and she said, I don't understand a word that you're talking about, but I don't understand you the way I don't understand Peter Ho, so I'll get you together. Yeah, and we got together, and this is a really good example of a good civil service. I remember Peter saying, look, he made me an advisor the next day. He said, this what you're talking about won't work until you've done lots of experiments. I'll fund you while you get things wrong. Right? Now that is Singapore, and that actually is what civil service should do, is create that space. Yeah? Either way, he hit 70 this year. So the present he got was everybody he likes, which included me, got asked to write an academic article on something new we were working on. And they put it together in the book and gave it to him on his birthday. I mean, that's a lovely birthday present, right? So either way, so those kind of like update it. There's also a new book chapter out on forethought, not foresight. Foresight doesn't work because you've got to anticipate the future, but forethought does. That's a quote from Napoleon, by the way. Yeah, we can't have foresight, but we can have forethought. Yeah, so that's available as well. And I've just completed one on coaching. So those are there. So if we go to the EU Field Guide, it talks about 5 key things you need, and I'm going to talk through some of these, but not all of them. Yeah, but I'll leave time to pick up ones if you're interested. So the first thing is human sensor networks. Somebody always sees the gorilla. So how do you find the 17%? Yeah? Now what's interesting on this is called wisdom of crowds, if you've heard of that. Okay, so the 2 examples which I use a lot is if you get a group of farmers to guess the weight of a cow, the average of all the farmers' guesses is better than the guess of the best individual. Yeah? Now there are 3 conditions for this to happen. First of all, they must be farmers. They must have tacit knowledge and experience of the subject. Yeah, McKinsey's will sell you a consultancy team to guess the weight of any mammal you want, but it's not as good as a bunch of farmers at a county fair. Secondly, none of the farmers must know what the other farmers have guessed, because then they bracket the first guess. And the third thing, which everybody forgets, including Saranaki in his book, is there must be nothing at stake for the individual. It must be a game. Right? So when we're doing mass consultation of employees, and let's give you an example, something we're doing at the moment on cultural mapping. So we present 6 cartoons drawn by somebody from that culture to the organisation. Cartoons are savage. Yeah, you can make points in cartoons you can't make in writing. Yeah? So we present 6 cartoons. People choose the cartoon which represents the culture of their organisation. They then tell a story about that culture, and then they interpret their own story. This is key, and I'll talk about how we do that later. They interpret their own story. It's not interpreted by an algorithm or a computer or an academic or an expert. This is distributed ethnography. We can do that in 5 minutes, and we can present the results graphically to the decision maker at the end of that 5 minutes. And then we can present and represent the data to the population until we get a consensus. Start to see the principle? Yeah? What we need is the diversity, because we need to find outliers. Yeah? And again, that's the stuff we're now starting to do at government level. So we got the baccalaureate on board with this at Ollie Pecker, who's the director of it. We've done the experimental work. Our ambition, to be honest, is that every 16-year-old in every school in the world gathering stories every week. Yeah, and we're looking for country centres for that, because if we got that, we've got a counter to social media. This is a big project we did with the EU. Instead of trying to work out what is correct on social media, which is gamed, why don't you focus on controlling the input rather than trying to interpret the output? So I know where the data came from. That gives me more security, and that changes the way you do government policy. One of the things we're talking about at the moment in Wales is using this as one of the agencies, one of your equivalents, to build those networks to inform government. Yeah? Because if people can see a pattern in real-world stories, they're more likely to change than otherwise. Yeah? You can also do some quite clever things, so you can actually get them to tell stories and then show the different patterns of interpretation. So you saw it like this, they saw it like that. Right? They've both been through the same process, so that means they have to think differently about the problem. And I'll make this point now. We only engage our brains when we get an anomaly. Yeah? Your brain actually makes very few decisions. Most of your decisions are made by your body or by your social environment. Yeah? When you pull your hand away from a hot plate, everybody's done that? Your brain fires after the event. Doesn't fire up front. Now, idiots like Richard Dawkins and Sarah and people like that, so that means you don't have free will. The trouble is they're working off a 19th century model which says the brain makes all the decisions. What the brain is doing is double check if the automatic response was right this time or not. If it was wrong, and it's consistently wrong, then we move from what's called autonomic processing to what's called novelty receptive processing, what Kahneman called thinking fast and thinking slow. But there's always been a better scientific explanation. And we don't do that unless we really have to, because the brain uses too much energy. Yeah? So if you want people to think differently, you've got to create anomalies, yeah? And otherwise they won't do something. Yeah? And we'll talk about various ways to do that. So that's key in terms of decision making. Now again, if I can present a politician or a senior civil servant, this is a pattern with an outlier, yeah, from a population gathering, so 10,000 school children gathered these stories last week, these are the patterns. That's very different from a small group of experts spent 3 months studying the problem and writing a report. Yeah, it also means people can go from numbers to stories without any mediation. Numbers are objective, stories are persuasive. Right? So that's kind of like the approach. So that's one thing. Second thing is informal networks. One of the things, I interviewed over 100 people after COVID. All decision makers fell back to their informal networks, not the formal processes. Because the formal processes had not anticipated COVID. So if you're a senior executive and things go badly wrong, you contact people you trust who you've worked with before. Those are informal networks. There's a biological metaphor for this, by the way, which is where we got some of the ideas from. So if you look in a mature forest, there are tree roots which represent the formal part of the forest. Yeah, they're arboreal, they can be traced. If you cut it off at the top, everything downstream dies. Those tree roots are connected by huge volumes of rhizomic mushroom roots, which have a symbiotic relationship with the tree roots, which are deeply entangled. And they will redistribute resource to weak saplings in a drought from mature trees. Right? So the forest is a complex ecosystem, and that symbiosis creates that. That's what an informal network does. An informal network connects people in novel ways. And you've all done this. You've gone to somebody senior and said, you need to talk to this guy. Everybody done that at some stage in their career? Because the executive trusts you and you trust this person, they'll be listened to. If they knock on the executive's door with a new idea, they won't even get through it. Yeah? So one of the things we've now started doing, this is a method called entangled trios, and I'll give you some examples of this now to make the point, is we want within 18 months to have everybody within 3 phone calls of the CEO. Right? So if everybody is within 3 phone calls of the CEO, we know the organization is densely networked and it's healthy. Now the Singapore government actually is like this because everybody does national service. So they spend 2 years in the army, then they spend years going back for exercises. So nobody is more than 2 phone calls away from everybody else, which is why Singapore is really dangerous. Never say anything which isn't true in Singapore. You'll be found out pretty damn fast, all right? Because the networks will work on it. Yeah? If you get invited to a meeting with 15 very bright president scholars, go on hyper alert because you're being tested, all right? I've had that a few times. On the other hand, if you look at the English government, and by the way, this is code, if a Welshman says England, it's bad. If we say Britain, it's okay. So I'll just help you out on that. If you look at the English government, everybody went to the same private schools and the same university, elite universities, so the network is unhealthy. Right? It's not connected, and people haven't got that tacit knowledge element in terms of where it works. Now, this is actually quite simple to do. So let me give you one example on IT design. Anybody been interviewed by a systems analyst to help you define a new program? Okay, well, be lucky, all right? The trouble is, what IT does is they send out people to interview you, then they design the program. Right? And actually, you don't know what IT can do. That's a kid. Nobody knows what IT can do anymore. So you can't actually let users define requirements because they're not aware of capability. But that's what they do. We develop things like user requirements docs and entity models so that we can make users sign up to something they didn't understand, but we could hold them accountable later. That's kind of like the way IT works. Now, the trouble is, if you conduct more than 2 interviews, remember that pattern entrainment I talked about earlier? If you conduct more than 2 interviews, you form a hypothesis based on what you've heard in those first interviews, and you only listen to things which match that hypothesis thereafter. Now, the major problem in social science research, interviews, focus groups, everything else like that, you get biased too quickly. Yeah? So that's not going to work. So what we do is we create 3. There are reasons for this. We didn't evolve as individual decision makers, we evolved as collective decision makers. And there are primary groups for that. One is a sexual pair for nurture. The other is an extended family, yeah, or working group, which is never more than 7 active decision makers, which means we'll compromise in groups of 7 or less, but we won't compromise in bigger groups. Yeah? You get what's called a deem, which is a hunting party of about 20, macro deems, which is where they come together. I'll go through that stuff later. But we know that small groups will find novel solutions, whereas big groups won't. Just been doing working with the NHS in Britain at the moment, where we're looking at triage. Because if you can prove triage in or out of a hospital, you save a fortune. If I have a big meeting room with doctors, nurses, ambulance drivers, hospital administrators, they all want to improve things, but nobody will depart from their tribal group. If I take one person from each tribal group and put them together and get them to work in parallel, I get novel ideas. Again, that's coming from evolutionary biology. So what we do is we take 3 people. One is a young, bright program who's really up to date on what the technology can do. You know, those really scary individuals who are far too young for their own good. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting old now, all right? That's the way it works. We then take a systems architect or an end system tester who is generally older and very cynical because they've lived through this crap before. And then a user trained to talk to IT people. It is much easier to train users to talk to IT people than it is to train IT people to understand users. And I actually think this is essential training for all executives. You have to understand how to communicate to IT. Yeah? And you can't do it by talking to them as if they were C-level. It doesn't work, right? Just to tell you, I'm repurposing the UK government's handbook on your child has got Asperger's syndrome, how do you manage it? Because that comes across intact. Yeah? So either way, so we have users. So I've now got a threesome. What we then do is we throw 15 trios at a problem for a month and see what they come up with. Lots of people from different backgrounds working in parallel, building small prototypes, then we integrate the results. That's the requirement spec. Now, that identifies things that wouldn't be identified other way, but it also builds a network between users and IT people, so the IT people now know users, so they can phone them up and have a conversation in a crisis, not going through a formal process. No? Now, again, another example, we take somebody who's just joined the organization with somebody who's about to retire, with somebody on the management fast track. So somebody young and naive, with somebody old, experienced with nothing to lose anymore, and somebody who wants to make a name for themselves. And we throw 20, 30 of those trios at an innovation problem and see what they come up with. It's far more novel. But what we're also doing, if you run that sort of process every 6 months for 18 months, and you change the membership, within 18 months, everybody is within 3 degrees of separation of everybody else. That's one of the most important things you can do for resilience is build the informal networks. You don't want them to happen accidentally, you want them to happen deliberately. And by the way, it's a much better way of solving problems than tiger teams or specialist groups or bringing in experts, but you're bringing diversity into the system. And generally, the techniques I'm going to talk about, one intervention does many things. So that's the second thing. Third thing. Now, this is quite important. Let me give you an example. There's a thing in biology called exaptation. Yeah? So dinosaurs' feathers, and we know this for the findings in North China. We now know that all dinosaurs had feathers, which is cool. That gives you an advantage over kids who are reading fossil books more than 10 years out of date. You've got one on them, all right? So basically, all dinosaurs had feathers, and they were very colourful. It's amazing what you can do with lasers in paleontology these days. Right? So the only reason for dinosaurs to all develop colourful feathers is sexual display. Yeah? And that's an evolutionary linear process. Then one small dinosaur, Dissy something or other, I can't remember the exact name of it, all right? And I'm dyslexic, so don't expect me to pronounce words unless I've repeated them 15 or 20 times, all right? I can't pronounce from text. So basically, it developed skin flaps to better display its feathers to get a mate. And it was a very small dinosaur, which was more prey than predator. So it had to run very quickly. As it ran very quickly, it started to glide, and that's how we got flight. Yeah, remember, all chickens started off of dinosaurs, and they haven't forgotten it, right? So basically, that's the principle. So a trait which evolves for one function, and the conditions of stress, it doesn't adapt, it exapts for a different function completely. You're probably all taught at school that fins became limbs when fish came on land. That's not true. Limbs developed in the ocean with one species, and when that species came on land, and the same with lungs as opposed to gills. They developed in the ocean for purposes which were relevant then, but then they exapt, not adapt on the field. The lovely example, which all of you are subject to, is the cerebellum at the base of your brain, evolved in apes to do fine-grained manipulation of muscles in fingers. Yeah, and you can see the advantage of that for feeding, for seed pods and stuff like that, and tool making. It exapts in humans to manage grammar in language. Grammar is far too complex to evolve in a linear way. It requires a non-linear exaptation. Now, if you think that isn't relevant, all right, do you know how microwaves came about? A Raytheon engineer maintaining the magneto on a radar machine noticed that a chocolate bar melted in his pocket. He realized the significance, so he put a metal box around the magneto. That was the first microwave oven. Yeah? Penicillin came because somebody forgot to clean their Petri dishes one night. Yeah? The other phrase for this in English, which I love, is serendipity. Yeah? A beneficial accident. Yeah? Now, exaptation is key. Nearly all of human technology is exaptive, not adaptive. IBM dominated the computer industry because it was the world's market leader in punch card control of machines and typewriters. So it repurposed that in the early stages of computing. It got first mover advantage. Yeah? I can give you lots of other examples on this, and there's examples in the field guide. Yeah? So one of the key things you need to do is the ability to repurpose something you're already very good at for something completely novel is more important for innovation than creativity. And I'll make this point now, and if it upsets anybody, I sort of don't apologize, but I'll explain it more later. Creativity is an emergent property of stress and pressure and perspective shift. The fact that creative people are innovative doesn't mean if you run creativity programs with childhood toys that they will become innovative. It's the wrong way around. The same is true in behavior, by the way. Behavior is an emergent property of people's interactions over time. So you may observe the behavior and say that's desirable, but trying to create that behavior won't work. You have to recreate the evolutionary pathway. Right? Start to get the principle here? Right? So one of the things we want to do is we want to map what we know at the right level of granularity so that we can repurpose it quickly in a crisis. So to give you a practical example on this, one of the projects we did with Philips Lighting in Eindhoven, as they had this bright idea. I need to be careful how I express this because it produced a product I'm ashamed of, but it's selling very well in Southeast Asia. Right? They had this idea that if you bought lights as a garden feature, they would have a whole new market. So people saw lights as things you lit the garden with or lit the patio. They didn't see it as a garden feature. Now, if you now go to the Chelsea Flower Show, which is my annual purgatory to keep my marriage intact, yeah, I'm made to go there every year, right? I mean, I now go as an anthropologist and take pictures of the people so I can survive it that way, all right? You will actually, I can't stand gardens, all right? But you actually find that light is now there with stones and plants as a garden feature. And that wasn't the case then. So what we did is we got lots of stories from people about gardens they liked and didn't like. And we let them take a picture or speak the story or write it. We didn't mind. We got all of that collected, and then we used what's called high abstraction metadata. I'll explain later. That's how people interpret their own experience. But it moves up this level of abstraction like art. So it's not gameable. You don't know quite what it means. It's graphical. We then got the whole of Philips Lighting to identify every shippable bit of technology they had. That was the criteria to get the granularity right. Anything you could package and ship is a unit. We got them to store that unit and to actually index it into the same structure that people had indexed their stories about gardens. So what I've now got is I've got abstract data. Remember I talked about abduction? I've got abstract data for capability and need. We threw the databases together. We got 5 clusters. Marketing looked at the clusters, so now I'm creating what's called anticipatory awareness. I'm saying, why are these things connected with these things? I'm not expecting to see it without prompts. And one of them became a multi-million-dollar project, as I say, of which I'm really apologize for. It's a plastic rock which changes lurid colours based on warmth and water flow, which is selling really well in Southeast Asia. I'm totally ashamed of it, right, to this day. It's based on a technology originally designed to handle urine-saturated staircases in Eindhoven football stadium. That's acceptation. Yeah? This is one of the big things we're now starting to work on with the University of San Diego and others, is get academics to index what they're working on, get industry to index their problems, match the databases together on a continuous basis and bring people together to say, why is your research actually indexed the same way as this requirement? So what we're trying to do is to stimulate exaptive thinking, and again, this is kind of like a service for government in many ways, is bringing together ideas and needs at the right level of granularity. Because if you can repurpose something you're already very good at, you get first mover advantage. And that's the history of technology adoption. So that's a key knowledge management task in terms of what we do. Fourth thing, I'm not going to go into this in much detail, but human beings are role-based. We like to make decisions in roles. What's interesting is if you look at crews, and Carl Weick did a huge study on this, what he actually identified is people in crews will tell stories of failure, individuals won't. So if you've got firefighters, every firefighter knows their role, because it's the role confessing to failure, not the individual. Yeah? You won't get individuals to confess failure, but roles will. Yeah? And the whole point about crews is people are trained in role and role expectation. So crews have cognitive capability which is greater than the sum total of the individuals involved. Yeah, so one of the things the EU Field Guide talks about is what specialist crews you need to have for day-to-day decision making and in a crisis. What's interesting in role-based decision making, people face less stress. Yeah? And you can ritualize that. Clothing makes a difference, interestingly. Some of the work we did on lorry driver safety in New Zealand, so we had a problem. I remember getting the project in when I was in IBM, and it said off-road safety in New Zealand, so I thought I'm going to do that. Yeah, off-road New Zealand, Lord of the Rings territory, mountains. Yeah, it wasn't anything like that. It was Wellington Harbour at 6 o'clock in the morning in winter. Anybody been to Wellington at 6? Yeah, it's very cold, right? The wind is coming in horizontally from the Atlantic, and there are orcas swimming in the harbour nearby, right? Which is nice in some ways. What we actually found is there, and again this is building something I'll talk about later, we put students into the lorries as ethnographers. We didn't send out experts to study it. Every lorry driver had a student, which was a lot cheaper than the experts, who spent a month with them in the lorry capturing stories, which was a university project for them. And the lorry drivers could use the students to help them, provided it was legal. We made that as a qualification, all right? And the students in return captured stories. Now what was interesting is trust in that relationship was very high. We found that amphetamine use was higher than anybody thought. And we discovered it was linked with safety procedures. The safety procedure was creating the problem because people were trying to limit driving time rather than use common sense. Yeah? We also found that 90% of the accidents, I think, happened in the first 10 minutes after a lorry arrived at the quay. So somebody would drive the lorry, arrive at the quay, start to unpack it. That's when all the accidents happened. And the reason was they were thinking like a driver. Remember I talked about we do pattern matching? So their patterns were driver patterns. It takes 10 or 15 minutes for the patterns to reset for a new task. That's when the accidents happen. Now, when you get into a car later on, you go through little rituals. You're changing the way you see the world. Yeah, when you walk through the door at home, we all go through rituals because that changes the way we see the world. It's called a cognitive activation pattern. So what we did is we gave all the drivers heated belts. We said you can't unload the lorry till you strap on this heated belt, which they wanted to do because it was very cold anyway. We halved accidents because we triggered that change of role, that change of attitude. Yeah, I mean, Les made me wear a tie for today, or I don't normally wear ties. When conference organisers insist on it, I tend to have it, the airline loses my luggage so I can turn up in a tracksuit and a t-shirt and everybody feels sorry for me. But I wasn't allowed to do that because I've told that story too often, so I was told I couldn't get away with it, all right? But putting on a tie makes me think differently about the world than turning up in a t-shirt. I've got to wear a dinner jacket with Les shortly at the opera, right? I will think completely different once I put that dinner jacket on than I do otherwise. Right? So understand the role of ritual in changing people's roles. Yeah? And again, it's coming back into that collective decision making. We're really bad individual decision makers. And if you know a good CEO, all good CEOs take people with them who complement their weaknesses. Right? Because they don't survive otherwise. Yeah? In terms of the way it works. And then finally, this is the energy gradient. So I'm going to talk about how we do this in a minute, but I'll give you a chance for a question first. There's a basic principle from physics. Whatever has the lowest energy gradient is likely to happen. Right? So one of the things we want to do when we map the current situation is map the energy cost of change. Because if the energy cost of change is high, it's probably not going to happen. If the energy cost of change is low, it probably will happen. And it's much more important to map where we are than where we want to be. Right? So that's mapping energy gradients, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Right? So those are kind of like 5 key things, and I've given you examples in each case. The concept of narrative, and I've talked about this, so let me now deal with this. This is your introduction. If you want to impress people, this is your introduction to Deleuzian epistemology. So not many people read French philosophers, but this is it. Assemblage is the wrong translation of this, but I'll give you the practical example. I tell a story, you tell a story, we like each other's stories. So we tend to listen to people who tell stories we like. And that doesn't normally matter in human society because there's lots of human interaction with reality to check stories before they go out of control. The trouble with the internet is they go out of control very quickly, And the trouble with AI is it magnifies the bias very quickly. A friend of mine in the Canadian Secret Police, basically, lovely phrase, he said it used to be that every village had an idiot and it didn't matter because everybody knew who the idiot was. But now the idiots have banded together on the internet to legitimize idiocy and elect, sorry, I shouldn't go down there. Right? Now, what Deleuze says is that is called an assemblage. Bricolage is probably a better phrase. The English translation isn't good. It's not an assembly. It's a constantly moving, changing pattern. Yeah? And the point about an assemblage is once you fall into it, it's almost impossible to escape from it. In complexity theory, it's called a strange attractor. It's a pattern of belief or attitude that once you fall into, because remember, you're only picking up a small amount of data before you make a decision. So trying to argue rationally against a strong belief system will never work. So what we started to do is how can we map those? Right, so this is a map of the assemblage patterns of belief in an organization. That's got about 50, 60,000 stories in it. All right, now let me explain how we do that because this is key and it will inform a lot of what I'm going to talk about. Everybody's done an employee satisfaction survey at some stage in their life? Anybody take them seriously? Net Promoter Score? Okay, so remember we got this in IBM and it comes in and it says, does your manager consult you on a regular basis? Scale of 0, not at all, 10 all the time. Now you know what answer they want. Right? So all the evidence is you will gift the right answer or you'll gain the answer. If I do Net Promoter Score, I know employees' wages are based on what I say, so I'll always employ the employee high, even if somebody else does. I'm gaming it. We know in hospitals, nobody will say anything negative about a nurse, so we don't get feedback fast enough. People don't like evaluating people. They find it very stressful. Right? Describing things is very different. Yeah, so we take a different approach. We say, what story would you tell your best friend if they were offered a job in your company? There's no hypothesis in that. There's no hypothesis that managers should consult you. Yeah, and then we give people a triangle, and this took a lot of time to develop and a lot of wiring up students to actually test the results. And the triangle basically says, in this story, the manager's behavior was altruistic, analytical, assertive. And people say, well, actually, my story is kind of like here. Right? Get the picture? So what I'm doing is I'm presenting people with 3 positive qualities. So they don't know what the right answer is. That creates an anomaly. I say I've wired up students. One of the advantages about a visiting chair in psychology is you can wire up your students and they can't complain about it. And everybody forgets that all psychology experiments are run on first-year undergraduate psychology students, so you should be careful about what you believe anyway, all right? But fundamentally, what that does, with 6 triads, I've got 18 data points. And critically, the person who tells the story is telling me what it means. This is called epistemic justice. The right to interpret your own experience, not to have it interpreted by an algorithm or an academic or a consultant. Yeah? And also, we want to work at scale. So it costs me no more to collect 1 story or 1,000 stories. It's the same cost. Right? And that's really important because I want that scale in terms of the system. Yeah? One of the first big ones we did was with the UK government in Pakistan. So we used skilled children's ethnographers on a British Council project, and we pulled in 50,000 stories over a week because nobody refuses a child on a school project. We didn't ask any politically dangerous questions, but when we looked at the patterns in what we'd come up with, we could show that radicalization was going from the UK to Pakistan, not the other way around, which made me very popular with the Home Office and very unpopular with the Foreign Office. And the trouble is the Foreign Office were funding it. We also proved the Foreign Office funding on misogyny had 0 effect when you looked at the stories, whereas people knew they would get more money if they said the right things on the surveys. Yeah? So that's kind of like a principle. Start to get what we're trying to do here? Right, that's a map of thousands of people either answering a question or evaluating a situation. And now you can see the assemblage patterns. So what I got, if this is cultural mapping, is people here are not going to be able to talk with people there. This is an outlier. People who are seeing things differently. Now, this also comes to the key aspect of humans. We did not evolve to work with statistics and spider diagrams. We evolved to work with patterns of meaning and patterns of landscape. This is a landscape model. Yeah, it basically says those are the patterns of belief in the organization. If I want to change something, so let's suppose this is desirable and this is undesirable, I literally click on this point and say, I want more stories like these and fewer stories like those. I want more stories like these and fewer stories like those. Now that's a change instruction anybody can understand. I'm not saying we want an abstract quality, I'm saying more stories like this, fewer stories like that. And what that does is it allows me to produce what's called a vector measure. What a vector does is it measures, are you going in the right direction at the right speed for the right resources? And that is an alternative KPI to an outcome-based target. Because outcome-based targets produce perverse incentives. We're doing a lot of this in hospitals at the moment. If you go to nurses and say, I need more patient stories like those and fewer like these, they're not threatened by that. They can come up with ideas. If I say, how do I increase patient safety? They get negative and defensive. Yeah? So this is called distributed ethnography, and I've been referencing that as we go through. Okay, so what I wanted to do was to get you some idea on this. The last thing I'll introduce from Deleuze, so it's our mission to teach continental philosophy around the world. Fundamentally, one of the things Deleuze talks about is he says what that pattern is, it basically says it territorializes the space. Once that pattern is established, it's almost impossible for people to escape it. So there are two approaches to that. One is you have to identify what's called a line of flight, ligne de fruit. Yeah? You have to find a weakness in the system that you can exploit, and that's some of the stuff we're doing in politics at the moment. Empathy is one way to do that. If you can actually throw human beings together and create empathy between people who hate each other, you will all of a sudden find change. I did that in Northern Ireland in the 70s. So, the approach to actually reconcile Catholics and Protestants, one was Coromila, get everybody into a big hall and tell them that they should be nice to each other, which always worked on the day and didn't work thereafter. If anybody hasn't seen Derry Girls lately, watch Derry Girls episode 1 of series 2. It's wonderfully satirized. We took 2 Catholics and 1 Protestant, or 1 Catholic and two Protestants, and we dumped them in Latin America in the slums of Rio de Janeiro for 3 months. We didn't talk about the troubles. Yeah, and they discovered pretty fast they had more in common than they realized, and they had a conversation about their differences in the context of working together, not in the context of facilitation. Now what we're now doing with the school project, and it's one of the big ambitions, is if I get schools to gather stories continuously, I can find problems which are common to right and left, to red and blue. I can then distribute money to those groups to work on that problem, to increase empathy between the two groups, but I don't try and work directly. This is a key principle of complexity work. I work obliquely, I don't work directly. Yeah? I don't want gaming system, I don't want people to know. Okay, so that was kind of like, I've given you the basics from the UFI guide. I haven't talked much about complexity, I'll just make one key point on this. In a complex system, there is no linear relationship between cause and effect. Yeah, everything is entangled. One of the best descriptions I've ever heard is Alicia Geraro's. She said it's like bramble bushes in a thicket. If anybody's gone walking in Britain, you know about bramble bushes and thickets, all right? You pull one bramble bush and something else comes out and hits you. It's like a mangrove swamp. Everything is entangled with everything else, and there are just too many variants, so you can't know what's happening. Now, a final test, all right? And with this, I'll stop and open for questions. Fundamentally, anybody heard the phrase, why didn't we join up the dots? If you read the congressional report on 9/11, which I spent a lot of my time on, you will actually find it. We should have joined up the dots. People were being trained to take off and fly but not land. It was reported by an FBI agent, so everybody says we should have paid attention to that. Yeah? So that's kind of like the issue. Right? Okay, so your problem is very simple. I'm going to give you a minute. Yeah? If I have 4 dots, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 linkages that can form between the dots. So 4 dots, 6 linkages. That means there are 64 possible patterns that can form from a dot or a link or any combination. Right, I'm going to give you 30 seconds, and I want you to be honest about this. 30 seconds, if I go up to 10 dots, how many patterns are there? 4 dots is 64, 10 dots how many? 30 seconds, starting to count now. Have a think, don't consult, and I'll pick people at random to come up with a number. 20 seconds. 10? Okay, you sir. What number? Yeah, you?
I've no idea, sorry.
Have a guess.
I've no idea.
Your business depends on it. Strategic executive decision, you can't, you've got to guess.
640.
600, how many people think that's too high? Too low? Yeah, not guessing because you know you've been on this before, you know you'll get it wrong. Okay, anybody want to have another guess? You, sir. Yeah. Anybody think that's too high? Too low? Starting to get the pattern? It's just under 3.4 trillion. If I go up to 12, it's 4.8 quadrillion. There's an old Chinese story about this. A Chinese sage went to teach chess to the Emperor of India, was asked what reward he wanted, and he said 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard, double thereafter. There wasn't enough rice in India. How many dots are there in the human system? How many possible patterns are there? Yeah? Yeah, hindsight doesn't lead to foresight. The fact that when you look backwards, you can see a causal chain makes you more vulnerable rather than less vulnerable. Like scenario planning makes you more vulnerable rather than less vulnerable. And the danger with all of this is what AI is doing, and I'll make this point strongly, is it's actually reflecting our past understanding, not our present understanding. Yeah? It's also working off text. Human beings do far more than text. Yeah, I've tried to explain that earlier. And the danger with this is if you think AI will exceed humans in intelligence, you're probably right. But the reason is we're dumbing down human intelligence to the point where AI can outcompete us. So one of our big research programs next year is to measure the degree of abductive capability in an organization and whether that's been maintained, because that's competitive advantage. Okay, yeah, I hope I covered the stuff you want. I'm more than open for questions. We're now open for questions. That was fast. You and then you.
One of the observations and criticisms that's been made of the Hong Kong government is that there's a lot of silos. Sorry.
Yeah.
One of the observations and criticisms of the Hong Kong government is that there is a lot of silos of information. Now, in order to extract stories that you talk about and to bring disparate systems together, how would your methodologies work to smash the silo?
Okay, so firstly, you won't be able to smash the silos, so stop wasting energy trying to do it. I looked into this, all right? People have been complaining about silos in government since Zolan, the tyrant of Athens. So for 6,000 years, we've been complaining about silos. And one of the reasons silos work is they allow people to talk at the same level of abstraction. If I'm in a meeting with a bunch of complexity scientists, I can say things much faster than the general audience. So part of the problem is trying to smash down silos breaks expert knowledge and dumbs things down. So you won't get rid of silos. One way to deal with it, and I'll go through 2 ways. One is build the informal networks. Informal networks are the way you handle cross-silo communication because somebody will know something and will make the connection. We're doing this in universities, by the way, now. By the way, when you join the university, you get put in a group of 5. If you're doing the humanities, you're put in a group of 5 with somebody from pure sciences, somebody from engineering, and so on. And you're given tasks every term. So we build the networks across the disciplines through the students. That's something which is really worth looking at. If anyone wants to know more about that, I'll tell you, because that's powerful. Yeah? And it gives you a sensor network as well. You can capture data in real time. So that's one way. The other way is metadata. So this is the problem we have with the intelligence agencies. Nobody will share information with somebody they don't trust. If you tell them they've got to, they'll pretend to, but they won't do it. I mean, IBM did this. They told me I had to actually share my knowledge of narrative work. And it wasn't I didn't want to share it, but I didn't want to put it in a database where anybody could use it and get it wrong. Fear of abuse is a more common reason for knowledge retention than actually power. Most people with deep knowledge are happy to share it, they just don't want to be abused. Yeah? So they told me I had to, and they linked it to my bonus scheme, and I had a teenage daughter then, so bonus schemes are critical to parental relationships. So I wrote a 34-page paper on narrative forming postmodernist discourse as a theoretical debate between Deleuze and Habermas that I wrote after 5 glasses of whiskey, because it takes that much whiskey for me to open a book by Habermas in the first place. I don't understand it to this day, but I had actually codified my knowledge, so I got my bonus. Yeah, and then one poor sod in IBM Australia apparently had spent 5 years trying to read this and understand it, and then discovered that it was set up as a... That's what experts do. They will hide knowledge. So what we did on the intelligence agencies is we don't want the data, we want the metadata. Remember those patterns? But then if I see a pattern in the metadata, I can come to you and say, I need this data for this reason. I don't need you to share the data in advance. Yeah, and that's more economical, and it handles higher levels of ambiguity than structured search. What you don't want is an algorithmic search engine without a people search engine. Yeah, and that's key. Okay, yes, sir.
Paul McComb, British Chamber of Commerce here, and Les is definitely not wearing a tie. I saw him earlier.
I know.
So you need to get your own.
He's
back.
always been a hypocrite. But he's English, it goes with the territory.
I spent 4 decades in the silos of the British government and the Foreign Office as well. Your 5 kind of measures or things really resonated, because you can... I've been involved during the financial crisis in 2008, bird flu, all these various things. And there is a very slick operation that moves into gold, silver, bronze reporting, gather information from all over, formal groups, informal groups, talking to companies, all this stuff. The thing that I observed probably in the last sort of 15, 20 years is that there was a time where that information flowed up into the decision-making at Cobras and things like that. The political imperative almost trumps, and a special advisor whispers into the ear of the wrong politician, we can't do this, or that can't be true. Yeah. And so they become deniers in this space. So actually, I think those measures, I would say the civil service and the Foreign Office hold dear, but their ability to work in today's politicized...
And we're basically saying they probably can't. I mean, this is harsh pragmatism. So that's where we start to use citizen sensor networks. The other problem is the civil service became politicized, and that was under Thatcher. Yeah, Singapore, it was interesting talking with Peter Ho over lunch one day. Sorry, you know the way Singapore civil service, where you're sitting on the table tells you how you're meant to behave, but nobody will explain it to you. You have to learn it over a decade, and I've learned that one, right? And he said the worst thing the British ever did was to get rid of the Civil Service College. He was appalled when they did it. I was with him with the permanent secretary, had the cabinet office at the time, and he was beating him up because he said, you've just destroyed the British civil service. Because the Civil Service College created common training, common networks, which are critical, and he always kept the Civil Service College going in Singapore. We're now saying basically what we want is these small groups of people to work together, but it's role-based, or we want citizens acting as a sensor network, because politicians will pay attention. No? So, and this is a key principle of complexity, you reduce the granularity to the lowest, to the finest level you can. Because if you work with very small things, they're less threatening, and they can combine and recombine in novel ways. So the work I didn't explain, we do on mapping energy gradients. We break all the actors down into their smallest components. Yeah, that deterritorializes the space. We then map them onto a grid with energy cost of change against time to change. That means anything top right on that frame will not change realistically. So what we're doing is breaking things down and breaking things down so people are happy about the data, then we allow it to recombine. Yeah? Now, because you can't rebuild the British civil service after what's happened to it, with a change. It takes years. Yeah? I remember this in, where did it happen? Oh God, yeah, so I was working with, actually I was at Spring Sunningdale. So, I mean, Spring Sunningdale, for people who don't know it, is where the heads of British civil service and the heads of British industry come together in the Chatham House rules. Yeah, and I've got to be careful what I say because of that, all right? It was when Richard was head of the civil service, who was a fellow Welshman. So I got the after-dinner speech, and it was quite a saga anyway, because I got the invitation. IBM went ballistic and said, why had I taken an invitation for myself, which was intended for somebody more serious? So the Cabinet Office had to explain, I've been invited despite the fact I work for IBM, not because I work for IBM, which upset them. And then they produced a slide set I was meant to present, and the Cabinet Office had to intervene again, all right? But I had the after dinner slot, which is the good one. And before I went on, you need to understand the context here. It used to be in British hospitals, there was a woman called the matron. She was a senior nurse. Everybody was scared out of their living daylights, even junior doctors, all right? The Hattie Jakes character in the Carry On films was there. And then they re-engineered them out of the health service. They got rid of them. They said they were a surplus level of management, which is when hygiene went ballistic. Interestingly, they didn't get rid of them in Northern Ireland because they were holding the system together during the Troubles. So I've always used this as an example of a complex system in which something which has evolved over the years creates informal stability. You disrupt it at your peril. The other disastrous thing they did was to get rid of nurses' hostels. Because if nurses had free accommodation, they all lived together, they worked together, they swapped knowledge, they built resilience. When they got rid of that, it was a disaster as well. They were trying to engineer the company. So either way, the head of the NHS ran up to me and said, you can't use the matron example. I said, why not? Defence have told me I've got to use it because they haven't got rid of their sergeant majors. And I'm young enough to be more scared of them than I am of you, so kind of like, I'm going to use it. And he said, no, we're bringing matrons back. I said, oh, brilliant. So you've got a 30-year program, have you? He said, oh, no, we've got a 2-week training course and a career route for them to become doctors. And I had fun that night, right? Now, that was the point. Something which has evolved over a long period of time has generally evolved for a reason. So you disturb it at your peril, right? And that, in complexity terms, is a strange attractor. Yeah? So what happens is human systems evolve with stabilizing mechanisms, yeah, which are informal, not formal. And the more stress you put the system under, the more the informal networks come to the fore. Yeah? Any more? Yeah.
Can I come back to this, the dot picture? You try to frame them into 3 different pieces and said they each have their own culture, their own heritage. Now I believe that we are in a world of communication. Compared with many years ago, we know each other much better than before. Yeah. We do communicate, we exchange, we have trade, but now it seems that it's not the case. It seems that there are lots of mistrust and even more misunderstanding. So even whether you group it or not, I suppose even the dot next to each other, they don't trust each other. Depends how you gather the data.
I mean, I would say it was a good question, but I did that once in Australia, and they told me I couldn't rate the question, I had to answer it, which is a good response to consultants. I'm sharing that with everybody, so everybody else can suffer the humiliation. I think one of the way you gather the data is key. So this, for example, is work we've been doing to map perspectives on AI. So this will give you another set of those triangles I talked about. So this is actually prompting people to say, give an example of something which you think might work or doesn't work with AI. Then you can see the index structure. You know, AI is impacted on shifting mindset, seeing the bigger picture, operational. Now you see pattern-based intelligence. You look at the skews. If those were numbers, you wouldn't look at them. Yeah, but looking at those skewed patterns, and this is what we're doing to measure attitudes, because attitudes are lead indicators, compliance is a lag indicator. So we just won an award for this with AstraZeneca, about measuring AI's impact in the organization and getting the balance right. Yeah, so attitudes matter. When we're doing the bigger pictures you're talking about, if you've gathered at scale over a large population, it's almost impossible for somebody to deny the results. So if I gather data from citizens at scale and present it to politicians, and by the way, politicians are more open to complexity than civil servants these days, because they get the grief when things go wrong. Yeah, and they're getting fed up of that, so they're more open than they used to be, right? So basically what I do is I gather the data at scale, and I can say, well, you know, all of our schools gathered this data, these are the patterns, this is a dominant pattern. It's almost impossible for somebody to deny that. Then you can get very clever. So, for example, I can present a situation to the whole workforce, get them all to signify meaning in it. I need to do that within a 10-minute horizon, because I don't want anybody to talk with anybody else. If you want the mathematics on that, if anybody talks with anybody else, the distribution becomes a Pareto distribution. If they're separate, it's a Gaussian distribution, so I can trust the results. Yeah? So there's statistics behind that. So I get all of them to do it and index the data, and then I can present the results. But then I say, this is how you saw it, this is how your people saw it. Yeah? Now, they can't challenge that because they went through the same process. This is not an expert telling them something. They went through the same process, they saw it differently. I'm creating an anomaly so people will start to think differently. And if you do it at this very fine-grained level, the consequences are lower than at a coarse-grained level. Yeah, this is this early intervention. So, for example, the work we did with GCHQ on measuring attitudes to cybersecurity. Yeah? Now, that was a really important project because what we did is we used the Met Office. They were happy to be experimented on. And what we did is we presented an example of a cybersecurity breach. We got everybody to tell a story about how it couldn't happen here, which we could mine for complacency. They all indexed it onto a set of triangles. We're about to launch this as a service, by the way. A set of triangles based on security theory. And then we could look at patterns. So we could go to a department and say, your pattern looks like this. Or we could go to the permanent secretary and say, your pattern looks like this. This is called fractal representation. So from the same data, you present the data at people's level of competence to make a difference. And you could say, how can you get more observations like these and fewer observations like that? Yeah, we did that first with Boeing on safety. So we gathered stories from engineers continuously. Yeah, and then we presented the data to the whole of the board, but then we presented each factory in each work group with their own representation from the same source data. So everybody is doing more like this, fewer like that. But of course, they're all going in different directions because they're starting in different places. So instead of having a one-size-fits-all change program, yeah, you have multiple small shifts. It's called micro-nudging. So the system moves in multiple directions, but it starts to align. So alignment is a consequence of action. It's not a cause of action. And by the way, the last thing you should ever do if you want to have a transformation is announce a transformation program. Because everybody's been through too many of them, and they'll move immediately into, oh my God, we're going through one of those again. What am I meant to say this time? Yeah. Yeah. Any more? Yeah.
Thanks. Has the PAP in Singapore been adopting this methodology to win their elections? They've done spectacularly well, actually, in a difficult environment recently, one. The second question is, Harvard Business School and the case study method and the HBR is antithesis of what you've been talking about in the last hour. How is it that they still remain successful with plenty of applicants giving them loads of money?
Hey, the most successful doctors were the ones who didn't believe in hygiene because they had, blood-spattered aprons, so people thought they were more effective. So remember I talked about narrative patterns? They persist long after their utility. Yeah, it's very difficult to disrupt a stable pattern because you have to create exceptions, right? I don't know whether the PDP worked. I know they would like the Workers' Party to have slightly more votes because it would help people believe they really are a democracy. I think they are, but it doesn't come across like that. We did actually make a huge difference in Colombia. We won the election for the president on this approach. Yeah, because actually if you can tell people their own stories, it's better than trying to communicate direct. If you're an executive in your organization and say, these stories are brilliant, can we have more of them? That's better than you saying, I want you all to be like this. Yeah, it resonates and it's immediate. So I think that's the key principle. But I say what we want to do on this open source database is to create literally a database of all schools which everybody can access. And we've already done that experimentally. It allows, for example, a kid in Colombia to get a story from their parents about coffee farming. This is a real case. And then say any other stories like this and find a story from somebody in Tasmania which they can tell their parents about. So you're trying to create peer-to-peer flow of knowledge items at a level where people can make decisions rather than have everything go up and go down. It's the same on distributed decision making, which is a big thing. So if you look at insect behavior, nature optimizes because it hasn't got a directing intelligence. The minute you have a directing intelligence, you always end up with suboptimal systems because the person exercising that power has too much power. Right? So if you look at the way bees swarm, they do a thing called the waggle dance. A bee swarm will always go to the best location because they have multiple micro-interactions. Yeah? So what we're now working at is distributed decision making. So I'll give you the development bank example. Development banks know that if they could give 100 grants of $500, it would have a bigger impact than one massive grant, but their accounting systems don't allow them to give small grants. Right, so we're changing that. Instead of actually giving money to people who say they can do things, which is a problem with grants, we want to give money to people who actually do things. So we spend a day simulating to find out the roles. Yeah? And so in this one case, we've got, this is a Catholic country, if the village priest, the village head person, the oldest girl still at school, the youngest boy considered a man, and an anonymous agent from the bank agree, they can spend $500, provided they record narrative about context, decision, and consequence. So anybody who can assemble a team, there's a limited number of them, if you can assemble a team, you agree to this, you do it, you can spend $500. Then we see what works. And the real money follows that. Now that's a massive risk reduction, cost reduction exercise, and it will find things you didn't expect to find. We're now looking at that in companies' innovation programs. Yeah, and it's based, and I remember somebody said to me, what if somebody can't find people to work with them? I said, well, that probably proves you shouldn't work with them anyway. Yeah, it's kind of like a bad idea. So we're currently, and the big one we're doing at the moment is end-of-life decisions for children, which is not fun in a hospital. But what we're basically looking is medical roles, if they come together, and we put a role in which is a parent who went through that horror 10 years ago. Because they understand it. If that group of people agree, but the key thing is one of the agents is completely anonymous. So nobody knows who it is. And that creates what's called a panopticon effect. If you have an unobserved observer, you are honest. So that means this is auditable as a process and it's less prone to corruption than grant applications. And it's also quite powerful if you're a politician or a senior civil servant. Well, if you want money, get these people together, do this thing, and we'll see if it works. Right? Now that's a complexity approach, is lots of small things in parallel and see what works, rather than trying to work out in advance. Yeah. Any more? Yeah.
So I actually, thank you very much for the slide. I see the 5 points is actually very related. I would say is human-centric. I just wonder if technology actually do play a role in decision making. And for example, I think if I compare it with maybe 100 years before, are we actually with tools or technology can make a better decision than the old days?
Yes and no, all right. And we use technology to do this. It's our product, which is called SenseMaker, right? So basically, we're using technology to gather the stuff at scale and avoid bias. Yeah, technology is useful. We use this to create training data sets. It was originally designed for the intelligence community to create epistemically balanced training data sets rather than rely on whatever you could capture from the web. And everybody's neglecting that on AI. The most important thing is how you construct the training data. You know, open systems don't work in that sense, right? So technology changes us. But I say the problem is, I mean, I can smell snow coming, but my children can't. I grew up in the country. Yeah, and this is epigenetics. If you don't know it, we now know the biological mechanism by which culture inherits. Darwin actually hinted at this. This is Lamarckianism. And it happens over 2 generations. It's chemically triggered on DNA. No? Now that's quite scary because we now have a biological reason why different cultures develop in different ways. So it's not a choice people make. And it's interesting, the work we're doing on impoverished areas, if you have very poor people, then the disposition to obesity becomes biological, not sociological, because it's an epigenetic effect over time. Right? So that's really important. I'll give you the classic example on this. If you get mice together, sorry, what we do to rodents is not very nice, right? So you get mice, you give them their favorite food, which they love the smell of, and when they're really happy, you then start to give them electric shocks every time you introduce the food, to the point where they run like hell when they smell it. You then let them breed, you let their children exist without smelling the food, and then their grandchildren you expose the smell to, and the grandchildren run like hell. That was one of the first major experiments. Eva Jablonka, who's one of the leads on this, is a good friend, is now arguing that the level of symbolism in your speech impacts on the intelligence of your grandchildren. And she's got reasons for that, right? So this is a real problem in terms of society change, right? So epigenetic effect is key. So again, what you're trying to do is to say, what has to be a human capability? Because the danger is, you know, there are things AI can do better than humans, but if we don't do them for a long period of time, we never develop the higher capabilities. Yeah? So when I was at school, I'll give you two examples. I know I'm getting old when I say when I was young, but I now know my grandparents were right. I just wish other people would listen. The two things happened. One is we had to learn a poem every week by heart. Now, it now turns out that's actually massive for cognitive development and for sense making. But progressive schools said children should choose what they want to do. The other thing which we did, which is my classic, is I remember at the age of 11, we were allowed to wear long trousers at 11. Until then, we had to wear shorts. Now, it doesn't matter in Hong Kong, but in a British winter in the 1960s, wearing long trousers was a boon, particularly when it was a 3-mile walk to school, right? And I remember walking to the front of the class at the age of 11 on Friday, and I got given a card, and it said, "You support capital punishment." Now, my mother was leading the campaign against capital punishment for the North Wales Labour Party, so the teacher was being mischievous. I had to speak for 7 minutes without preparation in favour of something I profoundly disagreed with. We did that every week from the age of 11 to 18. Right? That made us confident on our feet. It meant we read everything because we didn't know what we were going to get hit with. And we developed a capacity to argue and think on our feet. Now notice, the process generated the behaviour. We weren't trained to be critical. We were put in a position where we learned to be critical. Yeah? Now that sort of thing is what we need to think about, because that develops human capabilities. And I'll tell you, it's one of the things which really worries me, is there are no generalists left in Britain under the age of 60. Because the education system stopped producing them. Yeah, and T-shape doesn't work. Generalists understand a little bit about everything, and they're synthesizers. And you need a small amount of your company to be generalists, but they never get rewarded because the system rewards specialists. Yeah? So I think that's one of the issues, is how do we generate, and we're working with neurodiversity at the moment. So for example, I'm dyslexic. Now, I'm lucky and unlucky. It wasn't diagnosed until I was an adult. I just got bad marks for spelling, and I couldn't learn modern languages. Right? So I can't pronounce words from text. And I read 2 pages at a time on a book in literally 3 seconds. I pick up a pattern. If I want to read a book line by line, I use 3 different coloured pens to force myself to go through it. Yeah? But I see patterns nobody else sees. Dyslexia is very tightly correlated with innovation, and it's really frustrating as a dyslexic because it's obvious, but that idiot can't see it. The whole of the IT industry is at the Asperger's end of the spectrum, because that's what you need to do that type of mathematics. Now, I could go on with other examples. So we're now looking at how do you measure neurodiversity in an organization. Yeah? Because the idea there's a one-size-fits-all model of leadership is not true. Different leaders work in different contexts, and different teams work in different contexts. So neurodiversity is becoming important. And we're now starting to understand things that human beings can do that algorithms will never, ever be able to do. And the danger is we need to find them fast, because otherwise we'll lose them. If you don't use an asset as a human, it ossifies. Yeah? So I think that's one of the key things we're looking at next year. It's some key things we think educational systems need to work at. Yeah? You can't afford to become dependent on AI. Yeah? Because it actually loses critical capability in the process.